Professor Marcel Rauminger here. This is Module 6. We are talking about intervals here, okay? So, actually, this is not something that's entirely new. We've talked about, or sort of skirted around the idea of intervals a little bit when we talked about perfect fifth, or the fifth relationship, or even the octave, okay? So, let's explore intervals a little bit more and find out what they are.
All right, so let's talk about what are intervals. If I had to give a very simple definition on what are intervals, I would have to say it's definitely the distance between two notes. But when we think about why we study intervals and why they're important and what we use them for, or why we even have this discussion, it's more like the relationship between the two notes. And when we figure out reoccurring intervals and where we see them, well, it helps us figure out the inner workings of music. So let's take a piece of music right over here. Now, if we wanted to study the intervals in this piece, you can study them horizontally, like in the melody, from one note going to another. You can also study the intervals vertically, like in a chord. So let's talk about Pythagoras again. We're back to this guy. So remember Pythagoras? Remember when he came up with these mathematical relationships that told us that this is how we create mathematically pure sounds? Of course you do. Anyway, so these mathematical relationships that result in the octave and the fifth, well, guess what? Those are intervals. It's the interval of an octave and the interval of a fifth. So those are the relationship, or the measured relationship between two notes. So let's do this in terms of a G major scale. Here's my scale degrees. And let's take a look at some perfect intervals. So we have, for instance, the first note. Now, if we play that note and we all sing it together, we replicate this note, that is known as a unison. This is one of the most strongest, purest sounds that we have. Next, remember when we double the frequency, this is also a perfect interval. It is the interval of a perfect octave. Of course, another perfect interval, according to Pythagoras, is the fifth, perfect fifth. And the remember in the circle of fifths that if you go clockwise, it's circle of fifths. If you go counterclockwise, it's circle of fourths. Circle of fourths, or the fourth, is an inversion of the fifth. So, of course, that is a perfect interval as well. Now, all the other intervals are not perfect. Okay, they're known as, in this case, since we have a major scale, they're known as major intervals. Okay, so for instance, from G to A, that is not a perfect interval. It's an important one, but not as perfect as, you know, the perfect fourth or perfect fifth. So we call this a major second when we go from the first scale degree to the second scale degree. Same thing with a major third. Also, these major intervals are indicated by uppercase M and the number. So what about G to C? Is that a major fourth? No, it is not. Remember, that is a perfect fourth. So we can't have a major fourth, because that is a perfect interval. Same thing with the fifth. So we're going to skip over that. We'll go to the sixth, which is also a major interval. So G to E would be a major interval. G to F sharp, of course, is the major seventh. All right, so those are the perfect intervals, and those are the major intervals. Now, what happens if I take one of these notes and I alter them? Let's say I change, for instance, that B, and that B just became B flat. So I took the B, I flatted it, so I made the interval smaller. What would normally be the major third, now it's a little bit smaller than a major third. So it's actually not a major third, it's a minor third. So these major intervals that we described can become minor by bringing them down a half step. All right, let's do another one. How about this seventh? Okay, now notice that the F sharp became F natural. Same thing. G to F sharp is a major seventh. But if it becomes F natural, well, then that becomes a minor seventh. Now notice that the minor is indicated with a small or lowercase m to indicate minor. Now what happens if I keep going? What happens if instead of just an F natural, I put a flat there? Now the interval is becoming even smaller. Now it's known as diminished. All right, so indicated by DIM7. So it went from major to minor to diminished. Okay. Now, what about perfect intervals? Can those be altered? Well, of course they can be. Okay. Now, perfect, if we make them smaller, they don't become minor. There's no major or minor related to perfect intervals. So a perfect fifth, if I were to make that D flat, well, it goes straight to diminished. So all perfect intervals, when they're decreased, they become automatically diminished. So this is a diminished fifth. Okay, now what happens if I go the other way? What happens if I increase the interval? So I went from D to D sharp, bringing it up a half step. Well, this is known as augmented. So this is an augmented fifth. And by the way, major intervals can also be augmented. All right, so just to recap, our perfect intervals are the unison, the octave, the fifth, and the fourth. Our major and or minor intervals are the second, third, sixth, and seventh. And a major interval can easily become a minor interval and vice versa, okay? And of course, if I keep going in that direction, then they will become augmented or they will become diminished. Same thing for the perfect intervals. So now if we go back to our piece of music over here and I try to find out what these intervals are, I can figure out not just the distance between them, but the type of interval that they are. So D to G is in fact a perfect fifth. G to B, those lower two notes, are a major third. B to D is a minor third. G to A over here is a major second. And check out those two G's. Those two G's, that's a octave, which is a perfect interval. Yeah, Pythagoras.
Okay, so here are some helpful hints that will help you figure out intervals much faster. So, what happens if you see two notes like this? How do we figure out the interval when we see two random notes? Well, the first thing you got to do is you always look at the bottom note. So we start with this note over here, all right, and then we make a scale out of it. So let me make an E scale. All right. So I make a quick E major scale. Put in some sharps. Now I'm putting sharps in the actual scale. You can also put the sharps in the key signature over on this side. All right, so you can put the key signature there, or you can put them in the scale. I decided to put them in the scale itself. So I can find my two notes over here and over here. So there are my two notes. Then I just count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is a fifth. By the way, numbering the notes of the scale is also a really good idea. Kind of like this. So there you go. So there is the first note and there is the fifth note. So those were my mystery notes up here on the top. Okay? So now it doesn't matter if they are stacked or if they are in succession. So if you see two notes that are like this, you can use the same method to figure out the interval of these notes. So I take the note on the bottom over here, so this note which happens to be F, and then I make myself a little F scale. And actually, since these notes are very close together, I don't actually have to make the entire scale. I could just make the first 5 notes of the F major scale. I number them like that. I add numbers, and I see that, oh, it's actually, the bottom note is F, so then the top note is A. So I'm able to identify these notes. Of course, common sense dictates to say that the closer the notes are, the smaller the interval, and the larger the notes, the more far away they are, the higher the interval. So this is not, if the notes are like this far away, then it's not going to be a second or a third, and if they're this close, then it's not going to be a sixth or a seventh, all right? So you just kind of use your common sense a little bit. After a while, you're going to notice that finding intervals like thirds are going to be very easy to find. So you just go from a line to a line or a space to a space, and that automatically gives you a third. So with that type of thinking, if these notes are a third, let's go with these ones over here. So these are a third, these are all thirds actually. So if that's a third, then all I have to do is move one note a step apart, and I automatically get a fourth. So this is a fourth right over here, okay? So after a while, you get used to seeing intervals, like sort of reoccurring intervals, and you kind of get used to what they look like, the distance of, between the two notes. So at first, I would say write out the scale, write it out, put numbers underneath them. And then after a while, you get used to seeing what a second looks like, or a third, a fifth, and then of course an octave. All right? Hope that helps.
Okay, so now it's time for our quick check. Let's go ahead and listen to this interval. Let's listen to it again. Okay, do you think you know what it is? Pause the video, and when you think you have the answer, unpause it. Did you get the right answer? If you said major sixth, then you are correct. So if not, or you're still a little confused on how to figure this out, let's work through it. Okay, so remember, anytime you have an interval, there's always a note on the top, there's always a note on the bottom. It doesn't matter who comes first, or if they're stacked, or if they happen successively. We always look at the note on the bottom. So the note on the bottom here is F sharp. Now the next thing we have to do is we have to create a scale, and we have to write out a scale based on F sharp. So you can use a key signature. In this case, I've decided I'm going to use my whole steps and half step formula for a major scale. So here's my whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Okay, so I'm going to create my scale using these intervals. Voila! Here is my F sharp major scale. Let's go ahead and listen to it. So I use the whole step and half steps to make sure that all the correct notes are sharped or not sharped. So all the notes here are correct. Now once I've established that, I'm going to put numbers underneath each one of the notes. So the first note is 1, second note is 2, 3, 4, and so forth. So let's think about that interval. So the interval had the F sharp was on the bottom. There's a D sharp on the top. So which number note is D sharp? So it's actually the sixth note. So that's what makes this the interval of the major six. It's definitely a major six because this is a major scale, and it's not using any one of the perfect intervals, which is a perfect fifth, a perfect fourth, or an octave. So the answer is major sixth.